Tonight I'd like to speak further about the path of a Bodhisattva. And it becomes a very immediate question if one looks at one's spiritual path or one's path through life. If you put it in this way, what do we do or how do we respond to human suffering? What do we do with Rwanda or Somalia or Bosnia? What do we do with the homeless on the streets of our own communities? What do we do with the explicit resurgence of racism or xenophobia that's in our culture? What do we do with what some people call evil? It's not a word I use very often or like to use. Carl Jung put it this way. He spoke of our neurosis, that is, all the kind of psychological ways we get lost in ourselves. And he said that our neurosis is equivalent to or equal to the suffering that we have been unable or unwilling to face consciously. So in some way the evil in the world might be seen as the sorrow or the suffering of the world that human beings are unwilling or unable to face directly with their eyes open and their heart open. And therefore it gets projected on others of different religions or races or tribes or colors or sizes. If only it were so simple, says Alexander Solzhenitsyn, if only there were evil people somewhere insidiously committing evil deeds, and it were simply necessary to separate them from the rest of us and destroy them. But the line dividing good and evil cuts through the heart of every human being. And who among us is willing to destroy a piece of their own heart? So when we undertake spiritual practice, we come here to sit together. I see it as spiritual, human, psychological, political, all of those, piecework coming together. Because our sitting is not to have some particular experience or state, but rather to learn each day that we sit, to face our own life, our fear, our greed, our hatred, our delusion, and to open our heart to find a wisdom and a great heart of compassion in the midst of this life that we've been given, with its contradictions and sorrows and shame and anger and impotence and all those things that we face. In that sense, to undertake spiritual practice is a great human task. It is to fulfill or bring a kind of nobility into the world, so that in many of the Buddhist texts, the beginning is an address to you as one who is born of nobility. O nobly born, listen to this. It's a reminder of your own inner nobility. And what's very beautiful and ancient, people would come to the Buddha and say, this prince is coming, or this great, Brahman priest, kind of the bishop or the archbishop or the cardinal of this sect or that, and, what is it that makes a great priest or a great noble? And the Buddha would say, not by birth or caste or creed or status or class, none of that. That nobility is a matter of heart. And one who awakens this nobility, no matter what station or what place, that is one who lives a true life of a noble being. So spiritual practice is this human task of awakening a nobility in ourselves. And sometimes it's sitting still, sometimes it's acting in the world, politics or ecology. But it's nothing in particular. It's simply opening our heart and life to all that comes to us. Now, modern culture, as we know especially, has become very linear. How many people in this room have either little books or calendars in which they keep their appointments and their schedule in their life? Raise your hand. Look around, you poor dogs, right? It's worse than my life is measured out in coffee spoons. My life is measured out in little spaces in my schedule book. And so in these little compartments we have retreats or churches for sacred activity or temples. Then we have business for money and relationship for sex, or family for kids. It's not just that, I know. Or lovers or parents. And we have times for service and times for political activity and times for, vacation, right? As if they were all somehow separate from one another. And that our spiritual life was there in the temples, and our secular life was there when we went to the bank. And rest and peace was there after a certain number of obligatory days on vacation, when things quiet down. And spiritual practice could easily, for us, continue this same pattern of division and separation of what's sacred and what's not. So I'll tell a story tonight of a respected friend who was a monk, a Burmese monk on the border of Thailand and Burma, who had lived through some of the revolution in Rangoon that failed, been there when many people were shot and killed and many thousands of others lost their homes and thrown into prison, and marched with a lot of people as a support through the jungles all the way to the border of Burma to escape the terrible military dictatorship. A lot of people died of hunger and malaria in the woods. Finally got to the border there, set up a little tiny temple, a wooden kind of bamboo hut, and people would come, and it was a spiritual support. Beautiful man. And I got to know him there. One day, as I was spending time in some other part of Thailand, a mutual friend came and said this monk had decided to leave his temple and go to Bangkok and immolate himself, douse himself with gasoline like those monks in Vietnam, and burn himself, because no one was paying attention to the sufferings of the Burmese people, which are terrible, continue to be terrible. And we and the Japanese and Chinese and various other governments are selling their military dictatorship huge amounts of weapons in exchange for the logging of their teak forests and the destruction of their countryside. Good business. And as you know, weapons are our main export from this country. Very, very sad, shameful. So he decided the only way the world would pay attention is if he goes and sits in front of the embassy and burns himself. And I heard this, and of course, him being a friend, I was very upset. And I went to see him, and I said, how can you do this, He said, it's so important, no one's paying attention. We talked for a while. And then it came out that it wasn't quite so political as all that. That in fact, at his little temple, people from the Thai villages had also come to help support him because they support monks. And a young girl had come to leave food and help him, and he'd fallen in love with her. And he was like 44 years old, and he'd been a monk since he was 14 for 30 years. Couldn't imagine what he'd do not being in robes. No livelihood, nothing else to do. And besides, he loved that. But he'd also fallen in love. And he couldn't imagine not being with her. So he decided to burn himself as a political act. And I looked at him, I said, you mean you went through the revolution and you were shot at and you marched through the jungles and malaria and people are dying and, and you're taking care of these people and you've been through all these terrible things, and dealing with a relationship, an intimate relationship, now you're going to immolate yourself? Is it really that bad? He laughed a little bit too. Fortunately, he didn't. Fortunately, after that conversation and his own reflection and so forth, they talked some and decided to separate for a while and kind of have a cooling off period. And he decided to remain a monk, and she spent time by herself and eventually found another person to be in relationship with. It's easier to love 1,000 people in your thoughts than one person that you live with or nearby, you know. One person close up, person to person. So what we're talking about in spiritual life is not ideals. We're asked to do something that's difficult and great, and that is to embrace the whole of the human condition if we are to enact or awaken this nobility. Again, from Carl Jung, he writes about the erotic instinct, since we were just talking about this relationship. Something questionable, he says, and will be so whatever the future laws have to say about the matter. Laws don't seem to affect it much, do they? Eros, it belongs on one hand to our original animal nature, which will exist as long as we have a body. But on the other hand, it is connected with the highest forms of the spirit. It blooms only when spirit and instinct are in true harmony. If one or the other aspect are missing, then an injury occurs. It easily slips into the pathological. Too much of the animal disfigures the civilized human being, and too much civilization and culture makes for a sick animal. So we have this paradox, which is being alive. How do we hold in our heart these contradictions? The image or the archetype from Buddhist psychology and teachings of a being who brings all of these parts of life together and sits in the center is the Bodhisattva. Bodhisattva then is a being. Bodhi means awakened and sattva is being. A being who is committed to awakening and compassion no matter what happens in life. Again, remembering that this teachings we've gone through in Buddhist psychology speak about mind as the forerunner of all things, of our intention. And we can direct that intention from a place of fear, the body of fear, or we can direct our life from a place of the openness of the heart and mind. And the Bodhisattva, then, as an image, refers to that place in us that commits ourselves in all circumstances, in all times, no matter how things change, which they will, to use those circumstances for awakening. Like turning the compass, that the direction of our compass is toward compassion. Even if the sun should arise in the west, says Suzuki Roshi, the Bodhisattva has only one way. Even if the world is turned upside down, the commitment in this practice, this undertaking or of the path of Bodhisattva, is no matter what, awakening, presence, and compassion. Often there are vows that are taken in certain Buddhist tradition. Sentient beings are numberless, and all the tens of thousands of world systems and galaxies made of stone and fire and water and perfume and clouds and ice, and they describe 100,000 kinds of galaxies, beings. They arise in every form. I vow to awaken them all. Obstacles are numberless. You've noticed those. I vow to overcome them all. The dharmas are countless. I vow to master them all, the ways of the Dharma. And the Buddha's way is unattainable. I vow to attain it anyway. Now, what does it mean to undertake that kind of a vow? It doesn't mean we have to rush around and solve all the world's problems. That rushing around itself is part of the world's problems, you may have noticed. But rather it means to listen in your heart to your own particular gifts and capacities and the cycles of your life as to what it is time to do now with this that you have been given. Wendell Berry. A person who is willing to undertake the discipline and the difficulty of mending their own ways is worth more to the conservation or spiritual movements than hundreds who insist merely that the government or the industries or others mend their ways. So what it means is that we find our way to bring our heart and our whole being into the present, and then to respond. Be open enough to respond to what is presented to us as our spiritual life, whatever it is. I haven't told in a long time the story of Vinoba Bhave. Vinoba Ji was a close follower of Mahatma Gandhi and all of the Indian independence movement, and a wise man in his own right. And after Gandhi's assassination and the independence of India, the whole Gandhian movement was thrown in great disarray. For a year or two, the shock of that assassination left people just stunned. And finally, in the new country, they came together, some of them said, we must somehow continue this work of bringing the Spirit to the villages, to the community. So they decided to have a big conference to refocus the work of the Gandhian movement, and asked Vinoba Bhave to be the leader of it. He was clearly the kind of successor to Gandhi. And they asked him, and he said, no, that's just trying to turn the clock backward. Gandhi has died, and let's not kind of go back to the good old days. It's done, it's over, let go of it. But they insisted, and please come, we're all going to be together. And finally he said, all right, I will come if you wait. And postpone for 6 months the conference so I can walk across India to where the conference will be, not go by train or plane, but walk and listen to what's happening in India, and then maybe I'll know something. So he walked with a group of followers, and they went from village to village and held these village gatherings, as Gandhi had done, under the trees in the kind of center square of the poor villages. Partway through his walk, he came to a village where the people were very hungry. And there are many such villages in India. There are more very poor people in India than in any other country in the world still. More people hungry. And he said, why don't you grow your own food? Why, don't wait for the government or something to save you. Grow some food, get some water, and till the land if you're hungry. But they said, we can't do it. We are untouchables. They won't give us land. We're the lowest caste. Vinoba thought about it, and he said, I'll go back. When I go back to Delhi, I'll speak with Prime Minister Nehru and the new government, and we'll pass a law and get land sent to you, so the untouchables will have land too. Went to sleep after this village meeting. Then he woke up in the morning. He'd actually been up a lot of the night. And he called another meeting together and he apologized. He said, that was a bad idea. Even if I can get the law passed, you know how laws are, might get passed. But even so, by the time it goes through the states and provinces and districts and village headmen and all the layers of bureaucracy, if there's any good land left for you, I'd be surprised. It will all be taken by others. I don't know what to do. And he invoked a prayer and the sense of Gandhi, and one man stood up and said, how much land do they need? Well, there were 15 poor families in this particular village. 5 acres apiece. So what is that, 75 acres? Said, 75 acres. He said, I have land. In the spirit of Gandhiji in this new country, I will give this land. And Vinoba said, no. You can't just give it like that. Go back and talk to your family, to your wife, your children who will inherit all your lands, and make sure that that's really all right with them. So he went back and he asked, and he came again to a meeting and said, yes, they say I may do this. So this 75 acres of land was given to these 15 families. Vinoba walked to the next village, next day with his group, got together. We're poor, we have so little to eat, hungry, why don't you plant? Same story. So he told the story of the previous village. And in fact, a man got up and said, how many truly poor families are there in this village? 20. I'll give 100 acres. And he was sent to his family and came back, and as a result, the land was offered. And by the time Vinoba had walked to the conference, he'd collected 2,200 acres of land for poor families. He got up, and during the course of the event, told this story, and that was 1951 or 52, the birth of the Buddhan Indian Land Reform Movement, which was the start of the largest peaceful transfer of land ever known on the face of the earth. And for 10 years following that, Vinoba Bhave and thousands of his and Gandhi's followers walked on foot through every province and every district and most every village in India, collecting land without the government or anything else, and distributed somewhere between 10 and 14 million acres of land to poorest people. And yet he went to the meeting not knowing, what should I do? He just walked and he listened. And he listened really deeply. So this is the path of the Bodhisattva. To bring your heart, your being to the present, to listen and respond. And we usually don't know where we're going anyway. Haven't you noticed? I mean, it happens to us. It's like this person who saved all this money to go on a 3-month retreat and go to India and do this whole big spiritual thing and work for a couple of years and got all their time off and all their money together, and then, 3 weeks into the beginning of their trip and their retreats and so forth, their father had a heart attack. Went back home and realized that this man loved his father, that there was no one to take care of his father, and he needed to stay home and do it. And he stayed home and he nursed him and he cared for him for 1.5 years, till his father eventually died. There went his trip to India, his long retreats. And of course, you know what? He learned more, and his spiritual practice was truer and deeper, just going home and taking care of his father, than his imaginary trip to India would ever be. So the art is to become present and awake to what arises and respond with compassion. And it's not easy because there's a lot of suffering. My good friend that I mentioned, Michael Mead, I was talking to him tonight, earlier on the phone. He just got back from East Los Angeles, working with Luis Rodriguez and a mentoring program for young boys, particularly in the schools in East Los Angeles. And he was visiting and helping with this mentoring program where junior high school kids are mentoring elementary school boys, mostly boys, some girls. And he said, and they need it. He said, I don't know what to do with my own tears when I get home. He said, but there's been so much loss in the lives of many of these children because of gang violence and drive-by shootings and, divorces and alcoholism and all the kind of drug use that's part of the community and the breakdown of the family, because there's so much poverty, basically, that it doesn't hold together. That a lot of these kids don't look at each other. They don't look at one another in the eye. And he said, in a lot of the work that we're doing is to have these junior high school boys go in and teach them how to meet one another, just how to greet each other, how to say hello. They won't look at each other in the eye, partly because there's fear, and partly because to get close to another person would mean the potential of further loss. But there's been so much loss that it's scary to make another connection. Just to teach them to look at one another and how to greet one another and how to connect with another child, because the communities have suffered in such ways. So what to do? How to respond? From Chogyam Trungpa Rinpoche. When you awaken your heart, you find to your surprise that your heart is empty. You find that you look into outer space. What are you? Who are you? What is this heart? If you really look, you don't find anything tangible or solid. If you search for the awakened heart, put your hand through your rib cage and feel for it, there's nothing there but tenderness. You feel sore and soft, and if you open your eyes to the rest of the world, you feel tremendous sadness. This sadness doesn't come from being mistreated. You don't feel sad because someone has insulted you or because you feel impoverished. Rather, this experience of sadness is unconditioned. It occurs because your heart is completely open, exposed. It is like pure raw meat. Even if a mosquito lands on it, you feel so touched. Yet it is this tender heart of a spiritual warrior that has the power to awaken and heal the world. Kind of vulnerability and presence, and knowing the capacity of the heart of a Buddha of compassion. And that's really why we sit, to remember, to find, to awaken that again. The spirit of the Bodhisattva takes this intention that we spoke of to set our direction, to transform the circumstances of life, the joys and sorrows, to transform them into awakening and compassion. And we do it in our own way. No one can tell you how to do it. No one's ever lived a life like yours. It's an uncharted stream. No authority, no imitation. What we can offer, rather, is our presence. As one Zen master said, don't put any false heads above your own. Don't try to be like somebody else. Be yourself. An old sailor gave up smoking when his pet parrot developed a cough, persistent cough. And he loved his parrot, I guess. He was worried somehow that the pipe smoke, filled the room all the time and so forth, had damaged the parrot's lungs. So he took the parrot to the vet, right? And the vet examined the bird carefully to see if it had, pneumonia or some other kind of animal lung disease or whatever. And after a thorough examination said, nope, it didn't. He said that the parrot had merely been imitating the cough of its pipe-smoking master. That's what it learned, right? It's important in approaching spiritual life that it not be seen as an imitation. That it's not something that you do kind of put on a new costume or become a Buddhist or something like that. God spare your friends and family from that. Right? You come here not to become a Buddhist, I hope, but to remember, to awaken to the fact that you can be a Buddha. A good friend that I admire, that teaches with us sometimes and visits here, a man named Roger Walsh. He's written lots of books on Buddhist practice and Western psychology, other things. As a scholar as well as a meditator, he's done 13 or 14 of our 3-month retreats. He's got the record for that, of practice, and done Christian contemplative practice and shamanic things and so forth, and then writes about it as a psychiatrist to kind of legitimize it in the medical world. It's an uphill battle, I tell you. But anyway, also because he's an inveterate kind of adventurer in consciousness, he decided at one point that he was going to try to figure out how all these things fit together. And he read through the Encyclopedia of World Religions, which is a multi-volume set of books that describe all the main religions known to humankind. Shintoism, 12 kinds of Buddhism, from Pure Land to Zen to Vajrayana to Theravada, Sarvastivadin, the Zoroastrians, the ancient Sumerians, the Toltec and the Aztec, and on and on and on. And he said as he read one great religion after another, 80 or 100 of these, he said first he realized that each of these was a monumental thing, that millions of people had believed each one, and that they all had stories about the origin of the world and about good and evil and so forth, and how you should behave, and that they all kind of explained in their own language to people the world so they wouldn't be so frightened by it. But that as he read one after another, he realized that none of them were right, and that they were rather a set of words like a screen that was placed upon this great mystery of life that no words can really describe. There were ways that people used to talk about something that was universal and yet beyond all words. You get dizzy if you try and figure out the mystery. And Buddhist psychology is not a metaphysics, something else to believe. It really teaches a way of being in relation to that mystery, a sacred attention, a beginner's mind. So the task of the Bodhisattva isn't so much to figure it out, rather more, to find the right story or the one true story. There isn't one. Muriel Rukeyser wrote, "The universe is made of stories, not atoms." There are all these stories. Every person has a story. But rather to let ourselves rest in the presence of life itself. Sometimes I like to read from this book, Children's Letters to God, because they still have that sense of mystery. Dear God, are you real? Some people don't believe it. If you are, you better do something quick. Harriet Ann. Dear God, I wrote you before, do you remember? Well, I did what I promised, but you did not send me the horse yet. What about it? Lewis. Dear God, what is it like when you die? Nobody will tell me. I just want to know. I don't want to do it. Your friend Mike. Dear God, could you write more stories? We have already read all the ones you have and begun again. Gratefully, Emily. Or dear God, are boys better than girls? I know you are one, but try to be fair. Sylvia. So the practice of Bodhisattva is one of resting in that mystery that holds life, its joys and sorrows, with respect. Remember the story of the little boy, 8 years old, whose mother took him out to the restaurant, the Gold Nugget down in San Anselmo, or some restaurant like it. And it was time to order food, and they went around the table. The adults had ordered, and then the waitress said, "What would you like?" And he'd said, "I want a hot dog and a Coke." And his mother said, "He'll have meatloaf, mashed potatoes, and carrots, please." And the waitress looked at him and said, "Do you want ketchup and mustard on your hot dog? Do you want fries?" He said, "Yeah, ketchup and fries, please." Everyone with mouth sort of dropped open at the table, and the waitress left. She said, "Coming right up," left. And the little boy looked around at his parents and said, "You know what? She thinks I'm real." So there's a way, in a sense, the gesture of a bodhisattva is to bow, to pay respects to sorrow and loss and love and young and old, to pay respects to those who are weak and those who are powerful, all the same. The bodhisattva offers respect, which is really what everyone wants. Try it in your relationships. You'll see how your customers or your boss, or your spouse or lovers or children or parents respond to it. Kalu Rinpoche's wonderful old Tibetan Lama. Spent 12 years in a cave in Tibet and ever came to teach in the West. And at one point, visiting friends in Boston, they took him to the Boston Aquarium. And he liked all kinds of zoos and animals and things. As he went around, the Boston Aquarium's like the Monterey Aquarium, 3 stories of tanks and fishes and sharks and crustacean, all these eels and amazing sea creatures. And he would go up to each tank and look at all the forms of life in it. And before he would leave, even though the sign said, "Do not touch the glass," he would tap on the glass because he couldn't read English, Tibetan. Tap on the glass and then he'd go, "Om Mani Padme Hum," kind of do a little prayer, and then go to the next tank. Say, "What are you doing, Rinpoche?" Somebody finally said, "Why are you tapping on the glass like that?" And he said he was tapping on the glass to get the attention of the beings inside, right? And then he was blessing them that they too might be enlightened, that they should be liberated. What a way to move through the world, to offer your blessings to all the beings that you encounter. Now this kind of respect, compassion, simplicity manifests in so many different ways. The Buddhist tradition has 1,000 different images of Bodhisattva, of the spiritual warrior, of the midwife, of the family person, of the peaceful and silent yogi, of the goddess of mercy, all these different ways. Anathapindika, who is this famous and prosperous merchant, businessman basically, did well on Wall Street in the Buddhist time, or whatever the equivalent was, in trading in Chicago in the bean pits or whatever it was, right? Mercantile. And he found this beautiful park that a prince said he wouldn't sell unless someone covered it with gold. And Anathapindika said, "Sold," and covered this beautiful park with gold and offered it to the Buddha, and was one of his closest disciples, and did all kinds of wonderful things with the wealth that he had for the order of monks and nuns and others. Very generous. And Goenka, a teacher in India in that same lineage, or his teacher, U Ba Khin, who was the cabinet minister in Burma, not of one cabinet. Initially he was the accountant general for the new government of the country of Burma. But he was so good, he had everyone in his office meditate in the morning and take ethical precepts. Imagine that. He ran the IRS and the Treasury Department, and they started by taking the precepts in the morning and meditating. Then he was so good they gave him the Transportation and the Housing and Urban Development Department. He had 4 departments that he was running, and then he would go in the evening and run his meditation center. So that's another image, the politician. Or this grandmother that I studied with in Calcutta, kind of this great Buddhist saint, Dipa Ma, who would cook and teach the Dharma while she was cooking, rice and chapatis, and take care of her little grandchild and so forth. And was this wonderful, wise being that people would come to from various places and learn from. And she did it while she was being grandma. Or the Zen master I know, who had the homeless retreat in the streets of New York. Said, well, let's learn about homelessness in our practice. It's part of the Buddhist tradition to go forth from one's home. And so he took 20 of his students, and they had a 5 or 7-day retreat on the park benches in New York. And then in the evenings, those people, like other homeless people, had to go and find a shelter or a place to stay. And just to live on the streets, so that they would know in their experience what that was like and could respond to it as a bodhisattva. Or Vimalakirti, the bodhisattva in the Buddhist mythology, who worked in the gambling houses and tended bar, and then made himself sick and went in the hospital so he could teach the doctors and nurses the Dharma. That was a great sacrifice. To be a parent is to be a bodhisattva. It is. The amount of sacrifice it asks of us. To be a child is to be a bodhisattva as well. Sometimes it's to be in a cave. Other times it's to go out and teach. So many different ways. A friend came recently who works at Sloan Kettering Memorial Cancer Institute and said that the place was full of saints. Mostly they were in the guise of these African American home healthcare workers who would go and tend to people. And he said, I saw more saints in the 2 years working there than all my time in India. This is from Zorba. He says, I learned my spiritual lesson one night from an old man in the tavern in Athens. Night after night he sat alone at the same table, drinking his wine with precisely the same gestures. I finally asked him why he did this, and he said, young man, I first look at my glass to please my eyes. Then I take it in my hand to please my hand. Then I bring it to my nose to please my nostrils. And I'm just about to bring it to my lips when I hear a small voice in my ears, how about me? So I tap my glass on the table before I drink from it. Thus I please all of my senses and honor that which I drink. So many different ways, talking about it quite individually here one night. I remember, especially after what happened, the Rodney King uprising in Los Angeles, what people would do in response to that suffering. Somebody said, I teach, in San Quentin, and I work in the city with homeless people, or I'm working to keep the libraries open. People had all kinds of things that they do, their responses. Somebody raised their hand and said, I talk to the police. I go up to policemen whenever I see them and I say, how you doing today? How's it going? What did you think about what happened in Los Angeles? And he got applause from everybody. Because the way is not to step back from what's there, but to say, yes, this too needs my respect and my attention. In Zen, there are only two things. You sit and you sweep the garden, and it doesn't matter how big the garden is. You find your own way. I was listening to National Public Radio, and this woman who's the editor of the Sarajevo newspaper came to get an award in New York. And they put out the paper in the basement of this building by candlelight because they don't want to use the little bit of petrol they have, except when they have to turn on the printing press. So they do it by candlelight and offset 10,000 copies and spread them out through the city for the last, 4 years. And she was in New York at this big awards dinner with all these fancy people and lots of money given to her and so forth. And they said, you want to stay in New York? And she says, no, I can't. I couldn't stay here. I have to go back and put out the paper tomorrow, the next day, because so many people count on it. What matters is not so much what we do, but the spirit that we bring to it. The smallest things, how you drive, how we garden, our families, not an imitation. As Napoleon said, do you know the thing that most amazed me in my whole life was the power of the Spirit. He said the sword is always beaten by the Spirit. It's always so. Can't be an imitation, but somehow a learning that your heart, like the Buddhists, can break open, can hold with compassion the sorrows and the beauty of the world together. In this men's group, described by a friend who sits here, George Taylor, in this new book he's working on, they did an exercise one day in a men's group after they sat quietly together for a while to think about the end of their lives, a useful reflection. And then paper and pencil was passed out, and each man was asked to write their own eulogy, what they would like to see written about them after they died. What you'd like people to say, or what do you imagine they would say? People wrote them down and started to read them. Finally, one man got up And he said, I started this exercise, I didn't want to do it, because I started to hear the beautiful and completely false eulogy at my father's funeral that was given by a priest who didn't know him at all. And I felt so betrayed. No one knew what an incredibly difficult man he was, so they couldn't tell the truth of it. And I'm so tired of all the secrets in my family. He said, no one knows me either when I think about it. My own isolation, like my father's. God damn it, he shouted, I want to live. He was standing and shaking with energy now. I want to live. I want to express my life, to love my kids, my wife. He started howling and dancing for life as the men in the room clapped time to his wild dance. I want to live, he shouted over and over again. Men cheered loudly, and when the man stopped, several minutes of silence, then later, winded and happy, one of the other men said, best funeral I was ever at. We all laughed till we hurt. What do you want to leave? Because we can't leave very much. You know, we really leave what we've done with our hearts. So in this part of the Buddhist psychology is really a reminder and awakening to sense, to envision, to touch that capacity to live with dignity, to let go of the body of fear that we carry, to remember that we can be open, that it really is possible, that it is your birthright, that you belong on this earth, here, with its difficulties and its beauty, and that you can trust that you're not here by accident. So it's an invitation to you and to all beings to awaken. I want to read a poem. It's called Lost, to end. It comes from the Northwest Native American tradition. I don't know, the Haida or Kwakiutl or whatever. It's called Lost. Problem, you know, you're afraid of being lost. How many people in this room are lost? Don't bother. Lost, it says. Stand still. The trees ahead and bushes beside you are not lost. Wherever you are is called here, and you must treat it as a powerful stranger, must ask permission to know it and be known. Listen. The forest breathes, it whispers, I have made this place around you. If you leave it, you may come back again saying, here, just here. No two trees are the same to ravens. No two branches the same to wren. If what a tree or a bush does is lost on you, then you are surely lost. Stand still. The forest knows where you are, and you must let it find you.